Welcome to another Smart QA Musings, which, as I'm sure you know, is a gentle flurry of interesting thoughts. Today's topic is titled as Defects as Signals, what RCA misses. This is specifically inspired by a few conversations that I've had in the past on the area of root cause analysis. So, what's it all about? What I've heard from people is, despite doing a lot of detailed root cause analysis, they still don't seem to have gone through the kind of improvement that they contemplated. And therefore the question is, why? Because people who have done root cause analysis know what they have done. But despite this, they are not happy with the outcomes. And that prompted me to think, and I have also participated in a couple of those, and I found some interesting anomalies as to how they do. And that's what I thought I will probably muse about today. So, the way I'm going to structure, like most of the musings, is I will have some interesting analogies. Hopefully that will give some little more meaningful idea before we go into. So, before jumping headlong into the topic, let's come to it from some different angles. The problem that I have seen when people have analyzed more often issues is the kind of illusion that they get from analytics. What do I mean by that? They take the defects, they categorize it into, normally they categorize as in terms of which phase. Is it a requirements issue or a design issue, or more often like the software development phases. And then they go ask, why did we not find them earlier? What could we have done to find? Which is what seemed to be how people were performing root cause analysis. It seems to give them a completion that, I've categorized the defects. It brings a closure. But just because we categorize the defects and figure out and completed the record, does it help you to really understand as to what went wrong and therefore what we should do? Is it notion of just categorizing and therefore inferring from those categories? And I'm not really criticizing RCA per se. I'm only trying to recognize what it can and what it can't. So it seems to be closure, but it does not complete the understanding. Right? With that as a start and one of the ideas of the musing, I want to go on and look at, if I were to put the analogy of kind of operating from an auditor's desk, and if people who are doing, for example, analysis from a root cause perspective, ask as from operating from an auditor's desk, where did this defect land, which phase, who was responsible, when did it occur? They're good questions, important. I'm not saying that we should not ask those questions or they don't matter. But something more important, some kind of an accountability, traceability, etc. And that's really what I want to explore. We are auditing really the outcome. But what we need is a bit of a diagnosing the thinking. So it's not just about saying who missed it and then say, okay, now we need to fix this ownership gap by something. By using a process which is tightened, by measuring some metric or using some technology and stuff like that, or giving some training and stuff. So we're kind of immediately jumping on to the solution, right? So it's not just about the outcomes in terms of kind of an auditing kind of a thinking, which is why I use the word called auditor's desk. We're really more of a diagnostic person. So if we end up having these kinds of shallow questions, we'll get shallow answers. So which means, questions of who, when did it land, who missed, etc. So let's see, what does it take for us to go deeper to understand the thinking of why it happened and maybe therefore what we should do. And that is the case, it's the questions that are more important is not about where did this defect land, which phase, who, etc. But really about rephrasing it and asking what was the thinking that was missing, which probably resulted in some of these issues that missed. And that's really what I think is probably more important when we go through any improvement cycle. The defects itself, they don't ask where did happen. They really are asking what kind of thinking was really missing. They're not really just face failures, right? They are actually gaps in attention. So when you label an issue as a requirement error or a design error or a coding error, we're prescribing where it surfaced. But what's probably more important is not just the where. It's about capturing what wasn't sent, what interaction we didn't question, what boundary we didn't explore, what assumption did we accept, what context shift we didn't recognize, and so on and so forth, right? And that's what a defect is trying to communicate. It is trying to communicate something which we didn't think of. It was not just about assigning it to a face. So I'm probably belaboring the point of a face a little more strongly, because that's one of those things that I've probably seen in quite a few of these large organizations where they're more focused on. And then you ask the fishbone, you ask why, you get 5 whys and you get a very superficial answer at the end of 5 whys, and they don't necessarily give the full power of improvement. So we need to really understand the defects are basically signals of a missed attention, right? So taking this cue on this thought process that, it is a signal, it is not just a fact and to be categorized, what happens next? What can we do with them? Now let's look at it from very many dimensions, like the kind of the elephant story, right? Each of us have a certain view. So let's look at the entire notion and consider this as a bit of a diagnostic flow. So I'm not prescribing you a framework or something, I'm just trying to provide you maybe some thoughts on this, so to speak, right? So if you move from the notion of an auditor's desk to a diagnostic flow, the way we think and way we therefore ask questions may shift. Like, if we watch this defect from, let's say, 4 lenses, the lens of a doctor, what kind of quality, attribute, dimension, aspect failed? Was it in terms of correctness? Was it in terms of completeness? Was it in terms of logic? Was it in terms of performance? And so on and so forth. So the doctor sees a symptom, quite obviously, that's what every doctor does, but then what they're looking for is what might have caused it, right? So their intention is to look at it from certain dimensions of quote-unquote the quality, if you will, and find out what was the dimension that was compromised, and therefore probably figure out a potential diagnostic. Now a doctor does it on a living entity. I'm sure you appreciate that, right? But a pathologist does it on a dead entity. A pathologist may ask a question, who poisoned, so to speak. So it's like a deed is done, we have an issue, and that's where this is happening, right? So I think Ravi has a statement. I will come to that in a minute, Ravi. I know you have an interesting question that you popped up in the chat, which said if the defects are missed attention, then we cannot find all the defects. If, on the other words, our attention is always limited and focused to certain confined scopes. How do we see this perspective? Certainly come to you on that. Whereas when we talk about from a pathologist's perspective, we are more looking at it at the causality of the mechanism level. Why did it fail? What assumptions broke? What things? Not just things when they went wrong, but how itself the logic was possibly flawed. When you're looking at it from an investigator, like the air crash investigation role, really you're asking, why didn't we sense it? Why did the switch flip? Like the one that happened in AI 171, right? Why did the fuel switch get to cut off? So you're really looking at it from what is the sense that we missed? We have reviews, we have tests, we have gates, but why did it slip? So their intention is probably they're looking at maybe the logs and instrumentation of our probes, the early warning systems, and they ask, where is the blind spot in the sensing apparatus? So you kind of shift from the notion of, so to speak, the quality dimension or the poisoning kind of an idea, and moving into the notion of sensing. If you look at it slightly differently from a historian, from an archaeologist, you're asking slightly not necessarily technical questions, right? You're really asking, what is the context of the culture that produced this? What pressures and norms or historical patterns and layers of organizational culture, time pressure, etc. could possibly happen? So we're not just saying, the bug got made because of some technical stuff. There were really variety of other parameters that are probably conditions that happen, right? So in the diagnostic flow, what you're trying to attempt to do is to look at it from different conditions, different roles, and therefore allow us to spawn off some interesting questions, and then attempt to find out if we can be more closer to what could be possibly the real reason. So now coming to Ravi Surya's comment and / question is, if I want to rephrase it again, if the defects are the missed attention, then we cannot find all the defects, right? In the other words, our attention is always limited and focused to certain scores. Absolutely true. So we are focused, so there is an area that we will unfortunately miss. How do you see this perspective? And what you pointed out is a fairly correct observation, simply because when you are looking in a very focused manner, you don't always see the periphery. So quite obviously I will miss, because our attention is always missing as we cannot figure out and identify them. So I don't know if there's an easy answer to it, and I'm sure there is no easy answer nor a definitive answer. But the question here is, how much do we focus and how much do we meander? Maybe one thought, not the only thought, right? The second, which means you're saying, okay, I am focused on looking for one, but can I meander a bit? And therefore, if I meander, I should learn to come back also, because I don't want to get lost. That's number one. Second one is, when we focus, we put on a certain lens, and that is what we were trying to talk about in this particular slide that's up there. So if we keep on shifting lenses, right? So I think there is the 6 thinking hats kind of an idea that's there, been prevalent there. You say, I have a blue hat and yellow hat. Basically, they are telling you there are different points. So you're kind of shifting the focus from different angles, and therefore maybe that's another possible way to think about. Maybe I will not be terribly focused. And there could be a few more like these and that stuff. So I'm not deriding the fact that you should not focus or you should be, but I'm just saying that's a human frailty that is always going to haunt us. The question is, how can we do a slightly more improved job? Maybe these are 2 ideas that could be of assistance. And I'm not saying these are necessarily the only 2. Maybe we can deliberate and maybe find a few more to this process. So thank you, Ravi, for putting up this question up here. Oops, sorry. So if I go to the last one, now we talked about it from lens, we talked about it from the various ways by which we can look at it, moving from the auditor to the diagnostician to this stuff. Now let's look at it more from a logical perspective, or Holmesian discipline. And like what kind of Ravi said, you see what you see because that's what you do, but you don't necessarily observe. Observe is stuff outside also, right? So observation comes before explanation, and it's more evidence. And that's where I think, a methodology could be of some use. And I, of course, my focus has always been on methodology that I've been working on called the HIBIST, which is hypothesis-based immersive session, etc. Right? It gives you certain discipline to diagnosis, treating every defect as a hypothesis to be tested, not just a story to be filed and forgotten, right? And therefore the core discipline of this entire stuff is the observation comes before the explanation. So you observe, you construct a hypothesis. Your voice is not clear. I don't know why. I'm trying to do my best. I'm not even moving. Let me do my best. So we look at really what actually happened before we decide why it happened, right? And that's the idea here from a more of a Holmesian approach, so to speak. So, we talked about the lenses, we shifted to a bit of a logic. Let's connect both these two and then run through a small example of what I've used, what I've seen as certain effects of applying some of these ideas with some data. In this, all I'm trying to show is like, what is the utility if I shift lenses? What if I view it from an auditor's perspective? Yeah, it gives me an advantage of closure. It gives me an advantage of compliance, right? You get closure, you get compliance, you get a dashboard. It's necessary. What happens if I look at it from the doctor's view of investigation, of diagnostic investigation? Because where you're trying to cluster, as we talked about, defects from the quality dimension, maybe it helps us to get a problem and also figure out certain targeted prevention ideas. When you look at it from a pathologist view, what are you trying to get? You're more looking at a mechanism level fixes. You don't just understand what broke. You kind of understand how it broke, and therefore your fixes are a little more surgical, right? When you look at it from an air crash investigation, you're more interested in finding out how can I improve the sensing abilities? How can I be more context aware, so to speak, right? And the last one, which is more of a proactive intelligence, because you're being extraordinarily logical, you're not just trying to do. It is about hypotheses and intelligence that we're talking about. And that's, so we're not trying to replace RCA per se. What we're trying to do is we're trying to apply, if you will, the various lenses, but maybe to a stronger degree, driven by a Holmesian approach, and that's where probably it adds more depth, and therefore the actions that we come up with is not sometimes the generic answers that we possibly try to get when we apply the typical notion of RCA sometimes. What do I mean by that? Some of the typical RCA stuff has been, we should do better training, or we should improve the skill, or we should use some tool, or we should spend more time, or we should, tighten certain templates, and so on and so forth. I don't know if we need to go through such a detailed investigation to find these kinds of answers, because these are seemingly very commonplace, right? And that's why I think sometimes the trouble of RCA is. So if I were to relook at it from the smart QA sequence, applying the, keeping in mind the Holmesian thinking and keeping idea inspired by some of these lenses, it is in a way to look at it as in this 4W, so to speak, before we get the how, right? What dimension of quality? What is the dimension? We'll take a look in a minute. Where did it occur? What kind of granularity are we talking? Are we talking about a particular small feature? Are we talking about a false fragment of code? Are we talking about the entire sequence of business flow, like end to end? Where? And then the context, and then the why, the gap, right? So we're kind of going to try to see if we can analyze, treating the defect as a signal from what, where, when, how. And that's where I thought the Holmesian idea of high-based as a methodology could be of some use. So what is the dimension I'm looking at? I'm looking at it from some kind of a notion of a categorization of different kinds of defects into the notion of levels, where you say there are different classes of issues, and they can be, in a way, structured into also levels. So what do I mean by categories of defects? Some are related to handling of data, some are related to handling of the interface, some are related to how the internal structure is built, some are related to the actual behavior as displayed from the business logic and conditions, and so on, and going all the way outward into external environment and dependencies, manifestations of them into non-functional, or more often, which is appropriately called as attributes displayed by the system, and finally the way it is deployed and used and exploited by real external systems, people, etc. Right? So there are different classes of issues. So rather than looking at it from a face, I'm trying to categorize the defects into certain dimensions, or in this case the levels and categories of defects. And I think there is about 8 levels within our engineering piece. And I'm saying maybe if I could categorize some of these defects that I get into some of these levels, even if it's approximate, it is okay. And if I consider that round ones and square ones as a, maybe early stage and a late stage, that means one that could come during the construction phase and some that could come post-construction phase as the code is built. So we are saying maybe certain categories of defects across the early stage like L1, L2, L3, L4 should probably or would be nice to catch early. If they slip into the QA phase, they slip into the customer phase. So obviously that's an escape, right? Obviously if these circle kind of an issues which are early stage, if they are found late, then I, as a person who is focused on validation, I am also unfortunately focused on some and I miss some of the bigger ones, and therefore there's a leakage, right? So what we're really saying is maybe a notion of the categorization of certain categories of defects could be of a slightly better nuanced, like the attributes of a doctor, right? And therefore, rather than just immediately straitjacketing it into a face-wise defect, may be better. And that's what I was trying to outline in this particular stuff. And therefore, if I have some metrics and if I'm able to put them into, let's say, the levels, and then I find some number, some hypothetical number, that I have here, of some real-life project whose name is not shown. Oh, I don't know if I'm sharing is gone, or are you able to see the screen, or? Okay, I don't know why it stopped. I'll reshare. Are you able to see the screen again now? I suppose it's come back. So as you can see here, there is certain percentage of defects that are classed at L1, L2, L3, L4, which I think is more of an early stage, and some of them are late stage kind of a stuff. So the idea here is to say maybe there is an opportunity of earlier stage containment possible because about a third of them. So maybe we could do. So like that, we can possibly give us a little more specific suggestions into what to do. So I'm using the idea of levels as a Holmesian thinking, looking at it from different angles. Right? Now, it's not only necessary to look at analytics of defects, maybe also test cases or whatever you call them, ideas, probes, test cases, whatever, and therefore also have an idea of to say, okay, how are the test cases, so to speak, available? Are they more focused on early stage entities like code and screens and stuff like that, or how much of them are related to end-to-end business flows? And as you can see in this particular picture, there seems to be, according to this data, hardly any meaningful test cases that validate end-to-end flow. But then there seems to be predominantly a lot more test cases trying to validate what I call a structural component, or basically early stage code. So it seems to be skewed. So the skewness is what worries me, right? So you have to be careful. Is there a skew? There's no right or wrong. It's just that the balance has to be there. And then you can really ask how many of them are conformance oriented, how many of them are kind of looking for an issue, and so on and so forth. So it's not just about RCA based on the outcome as a defect, but also the inputs as in terms of test cases and scenarios, or whatever you wish to call them. Right? So maybe the notion of categorization by level again could lead us to give a better, a more meaningful stuff. So this is part one in terms of looking at the defects or test cases in terms of certain attributes, and then making some sense. And I am using this methodology as my method of analysis to show you one of the ways how we could do it. But we must also ask ourselves, well, we always like to analyze defects and find a fault. But mirror is not only about showing what it failed. It is about helping you improve the signaling ability, right? That's what we talked about. When we talk about from the air crash investigation standpoint, it's like why am I missing the signals? A mirror showing how we think and therefore how we probe and therefore why we missed, right? So when we start looking at the mirror, not in terms of a blame kind of a stuff that I missed, but as kind of signaling, giving you, maybe I'm more probing the positive aspect. Maybe I'm looking at certain only kind of issues. Maybe there is no issues in that, but how do I know that? I don't know that, right? So I will have to have a healthy suspicion, if you will. And if I construct such a mirror where I look at it more from not as a failure mirror, but more often as demonstration of my reflection of my thinking, could be escapes, could be certain aspects of distributions, they give you a sense of skew, and therefore maybe it helps us to reveal something more, and therefore helps us to monitor or do a more meaningful monitoring, which means we are able to sense better, make judgments better, and therefore slowly move this to how early are we noticing? Are we able to lower the amount of surprise? Are we able to have more precise actions, right? So and are we asking more interesting questions as appropriate? So it's not about proving the improvement that we are talking about. We are kind of focused on noticing the gaps that we are trying to do. And that is where I think the shift is. So we discussed in kind of three different things based on the idea of signals. How, the notion of more intrinsic property of the element, which I looked at as categories into levels and entities and so on. The second, the notion of saying, okay, if I do have something of that sort, can I construct some kind of a sensing window and therefore help us to see the signals better? And finally, of course, how do I monitor? It's not about, putting out a blame, but helping us be more sensitive and therefore notice the gaps, right? So we're really asking, are those corrective actions becoming more precise? Are they yielding some value rather than being generic? Generic as in terms of do more code reviews or do something, do it many, many times and so on and so forth. And monitoring is not about proving that we have improved alone. It is about noticing early where our thinking hasn't yet shifted. So it's kind of a feedback loop to constantly adjust, not necessarily just a scorecard of how well or how bad or how good we have done. Yeah, that is certainly not to be discarded, but that should not be probably the only goal, is what I feel. So in closing, in a way, the RCA, so to speak, the root cause analysis, sometimes typically practices more often a crash analysis where we say, look, it confirms that we crashed. But when we apply a little more smarter way of thinking, maybe it sharpens our vision, and therefore in the future we become a little more careful. We prevent, we sense, we adjust. So moving, we're not just the auditor kind of a desk where we say, okay, I've got a closure of all that stuff. We've assigned it, we have put it together and we are done. No, it's a very dynamic thing. We're constantly moving it to a diagnostic kind of a flow. We're asking what kind of thinking is missing. We examine some sensing mechanisms. We treat the defect data as a bit of a mirror, helping us perceive, adjust, design, right? And therefore sharpening the vision, constantly helping us to see a little more clearly, probe more intentionally, and of course sense risk hopefully earlier. So on a final thought, we fix defects, but the final thought to me is defects is not just asking it to be fixed. We all know that. They ask to be understood. It's like I said, a defect is speaking to you and say, understand me deeply enough so that you don't hopefully make me again. Hopefully you make a new one. Right? With that, thank you very much.